Hi, folks. Did the British military actually say that any slaves that joined against America would be freed? Let's talk about this. I am Tad Sturmer. I teach public history at Johns Hopkins, and I'm a scholar of the American Revolution, and I'm the film and digital media editor of the Public Historian. The fact that anybody is even answering this question shows you the pervasiveness of a patriot mythology that has to exclude even the most problematic elements from it, such as a war for independence benefited who, how, and independence from what? The answer to the question is absolutely. So let's get into it a little bit. There were several of them. The most well known, because it is featured fairly prominently in the 1619 Project, but other works, is Dunmore's Proclamation in 1775. That was fairly limited. Dunmore's Proclamation was issued partly because, as James Madison said, Dunmore understood that the Achilles heel of Virginia was the tense relationship between enslavers and the people whom they were exploiting. And anybody who understood that would be able to undo Virginia. Dunmore understood that. Dunmore became an enslaver himself. And so he issued a proclamation towards the end of 1775 that stated that any male enslaved person belonging to a rebel would gain their freedom if they came to serve him in arms, if he came to serve him in a military capacity. Fairly limited. It actually generated on thousands of formerly enslaved people to achieve their freedom by going to him. It didn't end well for a lot of them for a whole bunch of tactical and circumstantial reasons, but a lot of them ended up with their freedom as a result. And it gave this broader impression, that Dunmore was a defender of the rights of enslaved people, in a tactical sense, maybe. And it also kind of excludes all of the other broader measures that made it strategic British policy. There were similar proclamations that were issued by Howe, that were issued by Birch, but the major proclamation that actually establishes the rule is the Philipsburg Proclamation of 1779, issued by Henry Clinton, who was the British Commander-in-Chief of North America. His proclamation includes a lot of other things, but the core of his proclamation is that it applies to everyone, and it is largely based upon the legal theory that was set forward in the Somerset case in 1772, that no person can be claimed as property in England. He extended that to the British North American context within the war, that no person could be claimed as property behind the British lines, and any formerly enslaved person was free to seek their own occupation. They didn't have to come to serve. It wasn't applied to only males. It was everybody. It was only applied, at least initially, to the property of patriots, of the rebels, but it ended up being extended to anybody who made it to British lines, and then they would sort out the details after that. So the Philipsburg Proclamation makes it policy everywhere within British North America that if you got to the British lines, then no person could be claimed as property. That doesn't exist behind British lines, and that is reinforced over and over and over again, perhaps most prominently and aggressively by Cornwallis at Yorktown, when the Patriots demand that he gives up all of what they are calling the enslaved contraband that went to the British Army in the Carolinas and in Virginia, and that he is holding behind the lines at Yorktown. They demand that he returns them. He says no, because there are no slaves behind British lines. However, there are free people, and he will ask them if they want to go back. But if they don't want to go back, he can't make them, because there's no such thing as enslaved people. So that is sort of the historical background to your question. There are a couple of very good books about this. Some not quite so good books about this, but a couple of very good, but also a couple of very good ones. Simon Schama's Rough Crossings The Slaves, the British, and the American Revolution, is kind of a nice synthesis. He doesn't do any original work here. Simon Schama, obviously not a historian of the American Revolution, and so he bases this on a lot of secondary sources. And so it's not a terrible place to start, mainly because Schama is a great writer. The One of the better scholarly / popular books on it with a nice reach because she's a wonderful writer is Maya Jasanoff's Liberty's Exiles, American Loyalists in the Revolutionary War. She touches on what are called the Black Loyalists. And those are the enslaved people who relied on British promises of freedom versus those much more empty and less relied upon American promises of freedom, and the American promises being much more abstract, the British promises being much more clear and evident. But Maya's book is quite good on this. Michael Harriot's actually Black AF history is touches upon it a bit, and his is, I think, the best. It is the most incisive in terms of really getting to the heart of things, and so I would highly recommend that. But to me, the absolute best book on it, from a scholarly standpoint, that situates all of the ways in which enslaved people were able to gain and keep their freedom and really go into the numbers without sending you to like JSTOR, because there are a couple of good articles there. But it's all really kept within this book, and this book I've been talking about for a long time now, by Christopher Curry at the University of the Bahamas. It is Freedom and Resistance, A Social History of Black Loyalists in the Bahamas. Why does that matter? It matters because the Bahamas is made by Black loyalists. And that the population of the Bahamas increases by a factor of 5, from 2,000 to 10,000, made by free blacks, made by enslaved black people who bring their ideas about constitutional rights and constitutional governments to the Bahamas. But what he does in a wonderful way, because he's looking outside of United States history, which ends up being narrow and exclusionary, and it doesn't deal with these issues because it tends to be complicated and challenging for the patriot narrative about liberty and freedom, is that he covers what a black loyalist is, what freedom meant, all the ways in which black people gained their freedom, and all the ways in which they kept their freedom. And he covers how they did that by going to Canada, they did that by going to the Caribbean, they did that by going to Europe, they did that by going as far away as Australia, in terms of their evacuations from New York and Savannah and St. Augustine and Charleston, and gets in a bit to what numbers we're talking about, as from maybe 50,000 to maybe as many as 100,000. So we are still picking out this work, but this is based upon Chris's PhD work. It is a wonderful book that just goes into the nuts and bolts of all that. So that's how we know that the number of enslaved people who gained their freedom as a result of reliance on British promises. We get into the quality of that freedom, but let's not confuse freedom with slavery. That the number of people who regain their God-given right to freedom earned at birth from the British, that just dwarfs the number who get it from the Patriots. There are fewer. We know that there are fewer than 1,000 Black Americans who gain their freedom as a result of serving anywhere near the Continental Army. There are maybe tens of thousands that do that serving with the British, and then more than that by relying on the various proclamations. And then Dunmore comes back into it at the end in the Bahamas. But it is an important subject. It is one that absolutely eviscerates the Patriot myth, and it is one that that Patriot historians don't want to talk about. But there is plenty of scholarship out there on it, and it forms the origin story, the national story of these other countries that are products of the American Revolution. Places like the Bahamas and places like the Maritime provinces in Canada, New Brunswick and Ontario, and Ontario's not maritime, but Ontario and Nova Scotia. All a product of the American Revolution. But the Bahamas in particular has a museum. Its national museum is dedicated entirely to the people who gained their freedom, to the black people who gained their freedom as a result of their reliance on British promises issued during the American Revolution. It's a great place.